"This isn't working," my wife sighed, her voice heavy with defeat. But what she didn't know was that I had already prepared the answer, divorce papers that would change both our lives forever. From the outside, people probably assumed we were just another average couple navigating the ups and downs of marriage. But the truth was darker and far more draining. Our story wasn't the romantic tale it once appeared to be. It had unraveled into endless arguments, silences sharper than words, and a sense of living with a stranger under the same roof. What I didn't realize at the time was that the moment she said those words, something inside me would snap into focus. I had been clinging to something broken for too long, but her sigh became the final push I needed to end it for good. That is how I arrived at the decision that most people think about but rarely act upon. I walked into our marriage with hope, and I walked out of it with signed divorce papers, a strange mixture of relief and regret swirling inside me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But before I get to that moment, let me take you back to the beginning, because understanding how we got here matters. My name is Leonard, though most people just call me Leo, and for a long time I thought my marriage to Amelia would be the defining joy of my life. I grew up in a small coastal town where loyalty and family values were everything. My parents had been married for 35 years, my grandparents even longer, and I carried those examples in my heart as proof that love could survive anything. Amelia entered my world during my final year at university. She was different from anyone I had ever met. Sharp-minded, ambitious, with a laugh that could draw attention from across a crowded room. I was instantly captivated, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she carried herself like someone who had already mapped out her destiny and dared anyone to challenge it. Our first encounter wasn't anything cinematic. It happened at the campus library, of all places. She was hunched over a thick book on international economics, clearly stressed, and I had the audacity to make a small joke about how it looked like she was preparing for battle. To my surprise, she laughed. That single laugh opened the door to conversation, then coffee, and soon, late-night walks around campus where we shared our dreams. She wanted to work in policy and help shape communities, while I dreamed of building a business that could provide jobs in my hometown. We were two dreamers, convinced that together nothing could stand in our way. When we graduated, life came at us fast. Amelia landed an opportunity in a bustling city working for a consulting firm, and I followed, determined not to let distance drive a wedge between us. I found work as an analyst at a logistics company, not glamorous, but stable enough to help us settle into our first apartment. It was a tiny place with creaky floors and a leaky faucet, but we loved it because it was ours. Those were the good days, the ones I look back on now and wonder if they were the only real moments we had. We would spend weekends exploring new restaurants, sitting side by side at coffee shops while working on our laptops, laughing late into the night about trivial things that only made sense to us. Friends called us the couple everyone wants to be, and at the time I believed it. Our wedding came 2 years later, a modest yet heartfelt ceremony held at a botanical garden. I can still see Amelia walking toward me, her dress catching the sunlight, her smile lighting up the aisle. I thought to myself, this is it. This is forever. That's the promise I carried with me into our marriage. The unshakable belief that we would be like my parents and grandparents, enduring whatever storms came our way. And for a while, it truly seemed like we were on that path. Our careers advanced, our circle of friends grew, and we felt like we were steadily building the foundation for a future family. But life has a cruel way of disguising cracks beneath the surface, cracks that widen slowly until they can no longer be ignored. Looking back, I can trace the unraveling to subtle changes, late nights at the office for her, excuses that made sense at first but eventually became routine, my growing obsession with work performance and long hours that left me exhausted by the time I came home. We were living parallel lives, intersecting only briefly at dinner or in bed, and even then the silence often spoke louder than our words. Still, I clung to the idea that this was just a phase. I told myself all couples go through adjustments, that once we settled into our careers and routines, things would even out. I ignored the warning signs, the slight edge in her voice when I asked about her day, the way she pulled away when I reached for her hand, the times she sighed like she was carrying the weight of something unspoken. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to admit we were slipping away from each other. And that is where the story truly begins, with denial, with hope that refused to die even when reality screamed otherwise. Because on the day Amelia finally looked me in the eye and said, "Leo, this isn't working," it was not just her words that broke me, but the realization that deep down I had known it for a long time. The only difference was that now I could no longer hide from it. If I'm honest, the beginning of our marriage felt like a dream carefully stitched together from all the little moments that had defined our relationship in college. Amelia and I moved into a slightly larger apartment in the city, one with wide windows that let in the morning sun and a small balcony where she loved to sip coffee before heading off to work. I still remember how she would lean against the railing in her robe, hair messy from sleep, speaking with enthusiasm about her plans for the day. I used to look at her then and think, this is what happiness looks like. Those mornings felt sacred, like proof that our decision to be together was the right one, that the foundation of love we built could support any weight life threw at us. Our routine quickly fell into place. We both worked hard, but in the evenings we made time for each other. She would cook pasta or order Thai food when she didn't feel like standing in the kitchen, and I would pour us glasses of cheap wine. We would curl up on the couch, sometimes talking about everything, other times saying almost nothing, and still feeling connected. I treasured those moments. They were simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, they were the building blocks of a future we were determined to create. Our friends often told us how lucky we were to have found each other so young. "You two have it figured out," one of them said at a dinner party. Amelia squeezed my hand under the table, and I felt a rush of pride. We weren't perfect, of course, but compared to the constant breakups and messy relationships around us, we seemed solid. She was my anchor in the chaos of the city, the person who made all the sacrifices and long hours worth it. As the months turned into years, there were so many memories I still hold on to, pieces of the life that once made sense. On our first anniversary, I surprised her with a weekend trip to a quiet mountain town. The cabin we rented had a fireplace, and we spent most of the weekend bundled in blankets, cooking meals together and hiking through trails lined with golden leaves. She told me she had never felt so at peace, and in that moment I promised myself I would do whatever it took to keep giving her reasons to smile like that. Then came the time we got our dog, a golden retriever we named Jasper. Amelia had always wanted a pet, and after months of her dropping hints, I finally caved. Bringing Jasper home was one of those rare decisions that brought pure joy without complication. I can still see her kneeling on the living room floor, tears in her eyes as she hugged the wiggly puppy. We became a little family in that small apartment, taking turns walking Jasper before work and spending lazy Sundays in the park. Those were the days that convinced me our life together was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. I can't deny that the early years gave me a false sense of security. The affection, the laughter, the plans we made late at night, they painted a picture of permanence. Amelia talked about wanting to travel through Europe, to see Paris and Rome and Prague, and we started setting aside money for it. She wanted a house someday, not too big, but with enough space for children to grow up in. I shared those dreams with her because they felt natural. It wasn't just her vision, it was ours. We talked about the color of the walls, the names of potential children, the traditions we would create. That bond, that shared sense of direction, was intoxicating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At work, I pushed myself harder, always with her in mind. Each late night in the office was justified by the idea that I was building something for us. I wanted to be the provider, the man who could give her stability and security. Amelia was just as ambitious in her career, climbing steadily in her firm and earning the respect of her colleagues. We admired each other for our drive, often joking that together we were unstoppable. In truth, though, the seeds of distance were being planted right there in those long hours, even if we were too blinded by ambition to notice. The good times carried us for several years. There were dinner parties with friends, laughter echoing through our home, glasses clinking in celebration of birthdays and promotions. There were road trips where we sang along to the radio until our voices cracked, where we stopped at random diners just for the fun of it. There were lazy days when we stayed in bed until noon, binge-watching shows and ordering pizza, marveling at how easy it was to just exist together. Those moments felt eternal, like we were invincible. And yet, even in the midst of joy, there were small cracks that I dismissed as nothing more than the natural ebb and flow of marriage. There were nights when she would seem distracted, staring at her phone longer than usual. There were mornings when she didn't join me on the balcony, claiming she was too tired. I brushed these things aside because the overall picture was still good. I convinced myself that no marriage is perfect, that love means accepting imperfections and moving forward. One memory stands out, though, and looking back, it feels almost prophetic. It was during our 3rd year of marriage. We had just hosted a dinner party, and after everyone left, I found Amelia sitting alone on the couch, staring into space. I asked if she was okay, and she smiled faintly, saying, "Of course, just tired." But the way she said it, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine, it stayed with me. I shook it off then, choosing to remember the laughter of the evening instead of the silence that followed. The truth is, those early years gave me hope that our love was strong enough to withstand anything. I believed we had built something unbreakable, and that belief kept me blind to the warning signs when they began to surface. But for now, in those golden years, I held on to Amelia with everything I had, convinced that she was my forever. The first warning signs crept into our marriage so quietly that I almost didn't notice them at first, like hairline cracks forming in glass. They weren't dramatic, no shouting matches or slammed doors. Just small shifts in behavior that seemed insignificant on their own. But when strung together, they painted a picture of two people slowly drifting apart without realizing it. Looking back, I can see them so clearly, but at the time, I brushed them aside with excuses and hope. Amelia had always been ambitious, but her job began to consume more and more of her life. Late nights became the norm instead of the exception. At first, I admired her dedication and told myself this was just part of her career growth. She would come home past midnight, heels in hand, her face pale with exhaustion. I would ask how her day went, and she would shrug, mutter something about never-ending reports, then disappear into the shower. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt clipped and rehearsed, as if she had already spent all her words at work. Jasper, our golden retriever, became an unexpected witness to the silence. He would wag his tail eagerly when she walked in, but she often patted his head distractedly before collapsing into bed. I started to feel like I was the one keeping the house alive. Walking Jasper, cooking meals, tidying up. I didn't mind. It gave me a sense of purpose. But what unsettled me was how little she seemed to notice. She used to thank me for even the smallest gestures. Now it was as if she expected me to keep the machine running while she focused on her world outside. One evening, after another long day at work, I suggested we go out for dinner. It had been weeks since we'd done something just the two of us, and I thought maybe a change of scenery would help. She sighed, not in irritation but in fatigue, and said, "Leo, I really can't tonight. I just need to sleep." I told her I understood, but a part of me deflated. I ordered takeout instead, sitting alone at the table while Jasper's tail thumped against the floor, the sound echoing louder than the silence between Amelia and me. There were other signs, too, small but insistent. She started spending more time on her phone, sometimes turning the screen away when I walked into the room. When I asked who she was texting, she would say it was just colleagues, brushing it off with a laugh. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We had built our relationship on trust, but something about the way she clutched her phone tightly, even bringing it into the bathroom, gnawed at me. I told myself I was overthinking, that she had always valued her privacy, but the unease lingered. Even our conversations about the future began to fade. She used to talk endlessly about traveling to Europe, about the house she wanted us to buy someday, about the children we might have. Those dreams grew quieter, replaced by vague comments like, "We'll see," or "Let's not worry about that right now." Whenever I brought it up, she would change the subject, turning the spotlight back to her projects at work. It was as if the life we once planned together had been placed on hold, indefinitely, without discussion. One moment in particular still sticks with me. We were invited to a friend's engagement party, a lively event filled with music, laughter, and champagne. As we watched the couple dance together, glowing with excitement about their future, I whispered to Amelia, "Remember when we were like that?" She forced a smile, but her eyes drifted away, focusing on something across the room. "People change," she said softly, almost to herself. I laughed it off then, but deep down, her words landed like a stone in my stomach. The physical distance followed soon after. We still shared a bed, but the warmth between us was gone. She would roll to her side, her back to me, already half asleep before I even lay down. I missed the way she used to curl against me, how her hand would find mine in the dark without a word. I tried to recreate that closeness, sometimes reaching out to touch her shoulder or kiss her goodnight. But she would murmur, "I'm too tired," and pull away. The rejection wasn't harsh, but it was consistent enough to leave me questioning if I was asking for too much. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. She was stressed, overworked, maybe even overwhelmed by the weight of her career. I told myself that once things settled down, once she reached the level she was striving for, we would find our rhythm again. I believed in seasons, good ones, bad ones, and I convinced myself this was just a bad season. That belief kept me going, even as the loneliness deepened. But loneliness in a marriage is unlike any other. It's not the silence of being alone in a room. It's the silence of being unseen while sitting beside the person you love most. I found myself staying later at work, not because I had to, but because the thought of coming home to a half-empty apartment felt heavier than the spreadsheets on my desk. Friends noticed my absence at gatherings and asked if everything was okay. I assured them it was, plastering a smile on my face, unwilling to let anyone see the cracks forming beneath. The first warning signs didn't break us, but they weakened the foundation. They left me standing in a house that still looked beautiful from the outside, but was beginning to rot within. I clung to memories of our laughter, of the promises we had made, hoping they would be enough to hold us together. But in the quiet moments, when Jasper lay at my feet and the apartment felt colder than it should, I couldn't help but wonder if I was holding on to something that was already slipping away. The warning signs might have been easy to ignore in the beginning, but soon enough they became impossible to dismiss. What once felt like small inconveniences or temporary stressors began to grow into larger cracks that threatened to split our marriage in two. I wish I could say that I handled it with patience and wisdom, but the truth is I stumbled through it, caught between denial and desperation. The easy warmth of our home started to fade, replaced by tension that clung to the walls like humidity on a summer night. The arguments began quietly, often sparked by trivial things. I would ask Amelia if she could join me for dinner instead of working late again, and she would snap that I didn't understand the pressure she was under. I tried to explain that I missed her, that I just wanted time together, but my words always seemed to twist into accusations she claimed she couldn't handle. What started as calm discussions ended with raised voices, followed by long silences where neither of us dared to say more. The laughter that once filled our apartment was replaced by the sound of doors shutting too firmly, and the echo of Jasper's claws clicking nervously on the floor as he moved between us. Sensing the shift, I believe her absence became more pronounced, not just physically but emotionally. She stopped sharing her world with me, her thoughts, her frustrations, her joys. I used to know every detail of her day, down to the small interactions that made her smile or irritated her. Now, when I asked how her day was, I'd get one-word answers. Fine, or busy. Conversations became transactional, limited to logistics, groceries, bills, schedules. I started to feel like a roommate rather than a husband, someone who existed in her orbit but was no longer the center of her world. What made it worse was the creeping suspicion that she was finding solace elsewhere. I never had proof, nothing concrete that I could point to, but my instincts whispered it in the quiet hours of the night. She was on her phone constantly, texting with a half-smile she didn't bother to hide, then locking the screen the moment I entered the room. Once, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed repeatedly on the nightstand. I stared at it, my hands trembling with the urge to pick it up, to confirm what my heart already feared. But I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line, because as long as I didn't know for certain, I could still cling to hope. The physical distance grew harder to ignore. Intimacy had always been one of our strongest connections, but now it was almost non-existent. Weeks passed without even a kiss goodnight, and when I tried to initiate, she would recoil subtly, pretending to be too tired or too stressed. Each rejection chipped away at me, leaving me questioning my worth, wondering if I had become invisible in her eyes. I told myself to be patient, that forcing the issue would only make things worse, but the void between us deepened all the same. Friends began to notice the changes. At gatherings, Amelia sat further away from me, engaging more with others than with her own husband. When people asked where she was on nights she didn't attend, I made excuses. She's busy with work, she's not feeling well. But I could tell from their sympathetic looks that they suspected more. One evening, my friend Daniel pulled me aside and asked, "Leo, is everything okay with you two?" I wanted to say yes, to insist that everything was fine, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I gave a half-hearted smile and said, "We're just going through a rough patch." It was easier than admitting I no longer recognized my own marriage. The tension seeped into every corner of our life. Meals were eaten in silence, our once lively table conversations replaced by the clinking of silverware. Weekends that used to be filled with outings or cozy nights in now passed with her working in one room while I sat in another, both of us pretending not to notice the growing distance. Even Jasper seemed affected, spending more time curled up in the hallway as if unsure which of us to comfort. I tried to bridge the gap in small ways. I planned a weekend getaway to a lakeside cabin, hoping it would reignite some spark between us. When I presented the idea to Amelia, her face tightened. "Leo, I don't have time for that right now. Maybe later," she said, her voice firm enough to leave no room for discussion. I nodded, hiding my disappointment, but inside, something broke. It was no longer about time. It was about willingness. She didn't want to spend time with me, and that truth was far more painful than any excuse she could give. The arguments grew sharper, fueled by resentment on both sides. One night, after another long day of waiting for her to come home, I confronted her. "Do you even want to be here anymore?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. She froze, her eyes narrowing. "Don't start with me, Leo. You don't understand what I'm going through." I shot back. "Maybe because you won't let me in." The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any words we could have spoken. She turned away, and I realized with a sinking heart that my question had gone unanswered. The worst part of it all was the growing sense of helplessness. I wanted to fix things, to pull us back to the people we once were, but every attempt only seemed to push her further away. It was like trying to hold onto water with my bare hands. The tighter I tried to grasp, the faster it slipped through my fingers. I stopped recognizing the woman I had married, and worse, I stopped recognizing myself. I was no longer the hopeful, determined husband who believed in forever. I was a man drowning in uncertainty, clinging to a ship that was already sinking. As the problems escalated, so did my awareness that this wasn't just a rough patch. This was a turning point, a dangerous slope that could only lead to one of two outcomes. Either we found a way back to each other, or we crashed completely. At the time, I still believed in the possibility of healing, still thought love could conquer the widening gap. But deep down, I think I already knew. I just wasn't ready to face the truth. When you're in the middle of a crumbling marriage, it's hard to see clearly. You convince yourself that things aren't as bad as they feel, that maybe you're overreacting or misreading the signals. For the longest time, I told myself I was imagining the distance, that if I just gave Amelia more space, she would eventually come back to me. But the truth I was too scared to face eventually came into focus when other people began to notice the same things I was trying so desperately to ignore. It started with my sister Claire. She had always been blunt, the kind of person who didn't sugarcoat her opinions, even when you wished she would. We met for lunch one afternoon at a small cafe near my office. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and as soon as I sat down, she studied me with a frown. "Leo, you look exhausted," she said, pushing a menu toward me. I brushed it off, insisting I was just busy with work, but Claire didn't buy it. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down and leaned forward. "What's going on with you and Amelia?" The question caught me off guard, but before I could form an excuse, she added, "Don't pretend. I've seen the way she acts around you lately. She's distant." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I wanted to defend Amelia, to insist that it was just stress, but the lie wouldn't come. Instead, I lowered my eyes and muttered, "I don't know anymore." Claire reached across the table, her hand firm on mine. "Leo, you deserve to be with someone who actually wants to be with you. Don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who's already halfway out the door." I didn't respond, but the weight of her words sat heavily on my chest long after we left the cafe. It wasn't just Claire who noticed. My friend Daniel, who had been close to us since college, pulled me aside one night after a group dinner. "Listen," he said quietly, "I don't mean to pry, but Amelia barely looked at you the whole evening. Are you two okay?" I forced a smile and mumbled something about her being busy with work, but Daniel wasn't convinced. "Leo, I've known you both for years. She used to light up around you. I don't see that anymore." He paused, his voice gentler now. "You don't look happy either." Hearing it from him hurt even more, because it confirmed what I already suspected deep down. It wasn't just in my head. Other people could see the fading connection, the invisible wall between us. I had been gaslighting myself, convincing myself that things weren't as bad as they felt, but the outside perspective stripped away my illusions. The final push came during a conversation with my mother. She had always adored Amelia, often saying how lucky I was to have found her. But even she couldn't ignore the changes. One evening, I stopped by my parents' house for dinner. My father was in the living room watching television, and my mother and I sat at the kitchen table drinking tea. Out of nowhere, she asked, "Leo, is Amelia still in love with you?" The bluntness of the question nearly knocked the air out of me. I stammered, "Of course she is. Why would you ask that?" My mother's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. "Because when I see her with you, she looks elsewhere, like her mind is far away, and you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." I wanted to argue, but the tears burning in my eyes betrayed me. I shook my head and whispered, "I don't know anymore, Mom. I really don't." She reached over, placing her hand gently on mine. "Leo, love is supposed to lift you up, not drain you. Don't ignore what your heart already knows." Her words echoed in my mind for days. It's a strange feeling when the people you trust most validate the fears you've been running from. On one hand, there's relief. You're not crazy. You're not imagining things. On the other hand, there's despair, because it means the problem is real, undeniable, and not just a figment of your insecurity. The truth is, I had been holding on to the hope that Amelia's distance was temporary, that if I just tried harder, she would come back. But when I heard the same concerns reflected in the voices of my sister, my best friend, and even my mother, I realized it wasn't just me. Something had fundamentally shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. I started paying closer attention, no longer dismissing the signs. At social events, she gravitated away from me, laughing easily with others while barely acknowledging my presence. When I tried to join her conversations, she seemed irritated, as if I were intruding. At home, she kept her phone glued to her hand, stepping out onto the balcony for hushed calls she claimed were, quote, work-related. I stopped asking questions because the answers never satisfied me, but the silence between us grew heavier every day. One night, after another argument that ended with her retreating to the bedroom and me left staring blankly at the wall, I thought back to what Claire had said. Don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who's already halfway out the door. The truth of it hit me like a punch. Amelia wasn't fully present anymore. Maybe she hadn't been for a long time. And while I had been busy trying to patch up the holes in our marriage, she had been drifting further away, tethered to me only by obligation and habit. The external validation was painful, but it was also clarifying. It stripped away the layers of denial I had built around myself and forced me to see my marriage for what it truly was, a partnership that no longer functioned like one. I realized I was the only one still fighting, the only one still holding on, and that truth was beginning to erode me from the inside out. For the first time, I admitted to myself that love alone might not be enough, and that terrifying realization set the stage for what was to come. There comes a point when the weight of denial becomes unbearable, when the lies you tell yourself finally collapse under the truth that's been staring at you all along. For me, that moment arrived one gray Saturday morning. The rain had been falling steadily since dawn, pattering against the windows in a rhythm that seemed to mirror the heaviness in my chest. I woke up alone, as I often did now, the side of the bed where Amelia slept already cold. I stumbled into the kitchen and found her sitting at the table with her laptop open, her face illuminated by the pale glow of the screen. She didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I muttered, trying to sound casual. She gave me a distracted, "Hey," her eyes never leaving the laptop. I poured myself coffee and sat across from her, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, some invitation to talk. But none came. After a few minutes, I asked, Got a lot of work today? She nodded curtly, fingers flying over the keys. There was a wall between us now, one I could no longer pretend was temporary. I watched her in silence, the bitter coffee growing cold in my hands. The realization struck me with startling clarity. She wasn't here anymore. Not in spirit, not in heart. She was a ghost passing through our shared space, her presence more absence than anything else. For months, I had been clinging to the memory of who we used to be, but the person sitting across from me wasn't my partner anymore. She was someone else, someone who didn't see me, someone who no longer cared enough to try. The final blow came later that afternoon. I had gone into the bedroom to grab my jacket when I noticed her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Normally, I respected her privacy. I had never been the type to snoop, but something about the way she lunged for it when she saw me standing there made my stomach drop. "Who's that?" I asked quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just a coworker," she replied too quickly, her tone sharp, defensive. She clutched the phone to her chest and walked out of the room without another word. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding. I didn't need to see the messages. I didn't need confirmation of what my gut had already told me. Whether it was another man, an escape plan, or just the emotional distance she refused to bridge, the truth was undeniable. Amelia had left me long before she ever physically walked out the door. And in that moment, I realized I was already alone. That night, the house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. I sat in the living room, staring at the darkened television, and let the truth wash over me. My marriage was dead. It wasn't dying, it was gone. And the cruelest part was that I had been the last to admit it. Amelia had checked out long ago, and I had been left clutching the remnants of a life that no longer existed. Cruel. The weight of that realization broke something inside me. I felt anger rise like a wave, but underneath it was grief so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. I thought about the years we had shared, the promises we had made, the dreams we once whispered in the dark. All of it felt like ashes slipping through my fingers. I wondered how long she had been planning her exit, how long she had been building a world where I didn't belong. The thought made me sick, but it also lit a fire I hadn't felt in months. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have saved us. The truth was, a marriage takes two people, and I was the only one still standing in the ring. Amelia had walked away, whether she admitted it or not, and I was done fighting for someone who no longer wanted to be fought for. I remember whispering to myself in the quiet of that night, "This isn't love anymore." It was the hardest sentence I had ever said, but it was also the most liberating. Admitting it out loud made it real, but it also gave me the clarity I had been avoiding. I was living in a prison built on hope and denial, and it was time to break free. The next morning, I looked at Amelia differently. She moved around the house with the same distracted air, but instead of desperation, I felt detachment. It was as if a veil had lifted, and I finally saw the situation for what it truly was. There was no more pretending, no more excuses. We weren't partners. We weren't even friends. We were strangers occupying the same space, and I couldn't do it anymore. That weekend became the turning point. Rock bottom wasn't a dramatic confrontation or explosive fight. It was the quiet acceptance that what we had was gone, and nothing I did could bring it back. It was the moment I stopped chasing her shadow and started facing the truth. It was devastating, yes, but it was also the beginning of something I hadn't felt in months: resolve. I knew what needed to be done, even if the thought of it terrified me. Divorce was no longer a threat, no longer a distant possibility. It was the only way forward. And as painful as that realization was, it gave me a strange sense of peace. I wasn't losing Amelia anymore. She was already gone. What I needed now was to reclaim myself. And so, with my heart heavy but my mind clear, I prepared for the next step. I didn't know how messy it would get, or how much it would hurt, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change, and for the first time, I was ready to be the one to make it happen. The decision didn't arrive in a single dramatic burst, like lightning splitting the sky. It came quietly, steadily, like dawn creeping over the horizon until the darkness finally gave way. After that night of realization, when I admitted to myself that Amelia was gone in every way that mattered, I began to think clearly for the first time in months. The fog of denial lifted, and though the truth was harsh, it also gave me strength. For weeks, I had been paralyzed by the fear of what divorce might mean, of the shame, the whispers from friends and family, the finality of it all. But now, those fears felt smaller compared to the suffocating reality of staying in a hollow marriage. The weight of pretending had become heavier than the risk of breaking free. I remember the exact morning when I decided to act. The sky was pale blue, the kind of crisp clarity you only get after a stormy night. Amelia was already gone, leaving nothing but the faint trace of her perfume in the hallway. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank notepad in front of me, and wrote 3 words at the top: "File for divorce." It felt surreal to see it written down, like a command to myself. My hand trembled as I traced the letters, but underneath the nerves was resolve. I couldn't keep waiting for her to make the decision. She had already made hers by checking out of the marriage. It was my turn to take control. That same day, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Walking into that office was one of the hardest steps I've ever taken. The receptionist smiled politely, but I could see in her eyes that she had seen countless people like me, tired, broken, but holding on to some flicker of determination. When I finally sat across from the lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Miss Carver, I felt both exposed and strangely safe. She listened quietly as I laid out my situation, the distance, the fights, the realization that Amelia and I were no longer a team. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Leo, it sounds like you've already been divorced for a while, just without the paperwork." Her words hit me like a slap, but also like confirmation. She was right. Amelia and I hadn't been partners in months, maybe even years. The legal divorce would only make official what our hearts had already lived. Miss Carver explained the process patiently, outlining the steps, the forms, the timelines. She asked if there were shared assets or children, and when I shook my head, she said gently, "That makes this simpler. Not easy, but simpler." I left her office with a stack of papers in my hand and a strange cocktail of emotions swirling in my chest. Fear, sadness, but also an undeniable sense of control. For once, I wasn't waiting on Amelia. I wasn't begging for scraps of attention or pretending that a spark still burned. I was taking action. Of course, making the decision didn't erase the pain. Every step was heavy with memories. Filling out the paperwork felt like tearing pages from a book we had once written together. Listing the date of our marriage on the form brought back the image of Amelia walking toward me in her wedding dress, smiling like I was the only man in the world. Writing my name as petitioner felt cold and sterile, a far cry from the love letter vows I had once made to her. But beneath the ache was relief. Every line I filled out was one step closer to freedom, to no longer waking up in a home filled with silence and avoidance. Telling Amelia was the next hurdle. I rehearsed the words in my head over and over, but when the moment came, they still caught in my throat. She came home late one evening, dropping her bag carelessly on the counter, and I stood there in the living room with the envelope in my hand. My heart raced, but my voice was steady when I said, "Amelia, we need to talk." She glanced up, clearly annoyed, but froze when she saw the papers. "What's this?" she asked, her tone a mixture of disbelief and defensiveness. "It's what we both already know," I said quietly. "This marriage is over. I can't keep pretending anymore, and I don't think you can either." Her face hardened, but I saw the flicker of guilt flash in her eyes. She didn't deny it. She didn't plead. She just let out a long breath and sank into the couch, staring at the envelope like it was something poisonous. For the first time in months, I wasn't begging her to talk, to try, to fix what was broken. I was giving her the exit she had been inching toward all along. She whispered, "So this is it?" "This is it," I replied, and for the first time I felt a weight lifting. That night was tense, filled with silence, but it wasn't the suffocating silence I had grown used to. This was different. It was final, decisive. There were no more games, no more what-ifs. The decision had been made, and I had been the one to make it. Over the next few days, I moved through the motions of arranging things: bank accounts, utilities, who would keep what. Each conversation with Amelia was curt, businesslike, devoid of the warmth we once had. It was painful, yes, but it was also strangely empowering. With every step, I was reclaiming pieces of myself I had lost in the endless cycle of denial and disappointment. I wasn't just reacting to Amelia anymore. I was choosing my own path, one that no longer revolved around waiting for her affection or fearing her rejection. Looking back, deciding to file for divorce was the most difficult but also the most liberating choice I had ever made. It wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about punishing Amelia. It was about finally acknowledging the truth and refusing to live in a lie any longer. I had loved her deeply, but love cannot survive without effort, without partnership, without reciprocity. And once I accepted that, the decision became less about ending a marriage and more about beginning a new chapter of my life. I didn't know what the future would hold: loneliness, healing, maybe even love again someday. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I had made the hardest decision of my life, and I had survived it. Carrying divorce papers into a lawyer's office is one thing. Following through with them is something else entirely. The decision had given me clarity, but the execution tested every ounce of strength I had left. Nothing about it was quick or clean. It was a process filled with signatures, confrontations, and the painful logistics of untangling two lives that had once been bound together. Each step forced me to confront not only Amelia's absence in the marriage, but also my own attachment to what we had built, and the remnants I still had to let go of. The first step was filing the petition formally. I remember walking into the courthouse, the stack of papers clutched in my hands like both a shield and a weapon. The building smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, its echoing halls amplifying every footstep. I approached the clerk's window, slid the documents across, and felt my heart thump hard against my chest when she stamped the first page. That thud of the ink on paper felt final in a way nothing else had. I wanted to crumble in that moment, but instead, I straightened my shoulders and walked out into the cool afternoon air. For the first time in months, I felt like I was breathing oxygen instead of smoke. Amelia didn't fight me. When she was served, she looked at me with a cold resignation, as though she had known all along that this day was coming. We sat at the kitchen table one last time, discussing division of property. There wasn't much to argue over. Our modest savings account, the furniture we'd bought together, the apartment lease that only had a few months left. It was shockingly simple, almost businesslike. "You keep the apartment," she said, her voice flat. "I'll stay with a friend until I find something else." There was no warmth, no bitterness, just attachment. That hurt almost more than anger would have. At least anger means someone still cares. This was indifference, and it cut deep. Once she moved out, the apartment felt cavernous. Every corner carried a memory. The dent in the coffee table from when we'd clumsily set down moving boxes, the framed photo on the hallway wall from our first vacation, the mismatched mugs she insisted we buy because they felt like us. At first, I couldn't bear to look at these things. I boxed up photos and trinkets, left the mugs untouched because they were too small to bother with, and tried to keep my head down. But with every empty space, every item removed, I started to feel lighter. It wasn't instant. It was gradual, like shedding an old skin. The paperwork required my focus. Ms. Carver, my lawyer, was precise and reassuring, guiding me through financial disclosures, official notices, and the final hearing schedule. Each meeting with her felt like crossing another mile marker. The mountain wasn't gone, but I could see the path through it. I was grateful for her steady presence, someone who reminded me I wasn't the first to endure this and wouldn't be the last. She told me, "Leo, following through isn't about erasing your past. It's about building a future you can live in." Her words stuck with me on the nights when loneliness felt unbearable. There were confrontations, of course. Amelia and I argued once, over something as small as who would take the television. I remember snapping, "It doesn't matter, Amelia, take it," my voice breaking with frustration. She looked at me then, not with anger, not even pity, but with something close to relief. "You're finally letting go," she said softly. It stung, but she was right. I had spent so long gripping tightly to the idea of us, refusing to loosen my hand even as it bled. Now I was releasing piece by piece, and though it was painful, it was also necessary. The final hearing was surreal. We sat in a sterile courtroom, the judge flipping through documents, asking us simple yes or no questions. Amelia answered calmly, her gaze fixed somewhere past me. I answered with a voice steadier than I expected. When the judge declared the divorce finalized, I felt something shift inside me. There was no triumphant music, no cinematic moment, just a quiet closing of a chapter. I walked out of that courtroom no longer a husband, but something else entirely, a man starting over. Execution didn't end with the court. It extended into the quiet routines of rebuilding a life alone. Cooking, for one, felt strange after years of setting 2 plates. The silence in the evenings was deafening at first, the absence of Amelia's presence ringing louder than her words ever did. But slowly, I started to adapt. I rearranged furniture, painted a wall a different color, started running again in the mornings. They were small changes, but they reminded me that this was my space now, my life. I didn't have to carry her shadow here anymore. I leaned heavily on my support system during those weeks. Ethan checked in regularly, pulling me out for dinners or casual drinks when I would have otherwise stayed buried in my thoughts. My sister called every Sunday, her steady voice reminding me that family still anchored me, even when everything else felt unmoored. These connections mattered more than I could admit at the time. They reminded me I wasn't alone in the execution of this decision, that life still waited on the other side of grief. The hardest part wasn't the legalities or the logistics. It was retraining my mind not to expect her. I would still glance at my phone, half expecting a text. I would still wake up and reach for her side of the bed. But each time, the sting dulled, replaced by a new rhythm of living. Following through wasn't just about paperwork and hearings. It was about choosing, day after day, not to slip back into denial, not to fantasize about what could have been. It was about facing forward, even when the past whispered behind me. By the time the divorce was officially finalized, and Amelia was nothing more than a name on old documents, I realized the execution of my decision had done more than end a marriage. It had given me back something I hadn't realized I lost: agency. For so long, I had been reacting to Amelia, to her moods, her absences, her indifference. Now my actions were mine again, my choices no longer tied to someone who didn't want to walk beside me. It wasn't an easy road, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. When the dust of the divorce finally settled, I found myself standing in the quiet aftermath, staring at a life that no longer looked anything like what I had once imagined. For years, my identity had been wrapped in us, Leo and Amelia, husband and wife, partners in the journey of adulthood. Now it was just Leo. At first, the solitude felt like a void, an endless stretch of silence where her absence echoed. But slowly, that silence began to transform. It became space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to remember who I was before the weight of a failing marriage pressed me down. In the weeks that followed, I noticed things I had ignored for years. The way morning light spilled across the living room wall, warm and golden, reminding me of summers back home. The sound of the waves when I took drives to the coast, something I had always loved but stopped doing when Amelia preferred city nights to rural escapes. Even the simple act of cooking became something new. I experimented with recipes, burned a few meals, laughed at myself when dishes turned out awful, and celebrated when they turned out right. These little victories stitched together a sense of self I thought I had lost. I won't lie, it wasn't all peace and discovery. There were nights when loneliness clawed at me, when I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, fighting the urge to replay every moment of our marriage. There were mornings when I woke with a heaviness in my chest, questioning if I had made the right decision. But every time I started to spiral, I reminded myself, I didn't end something whole, I ended something broken. And sometimes, letting go is the only way to stop bleeding. The new beginning didn't arrive in one grand gesture. It emerged in small, steady choices. I started running again, rediscovering the freedom of pounding the pavement with nothing but music in my ears. I joined a local photography club, dusting off the old camera I had bought in college but never had time to use. I began reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from during the marriage, meeting for dinners, laughing over stories, realizing how much I had missed being part of a community that wasn't defined by couplehood. Each step forward was fragile but meaningful, a reminder that life wasn't ending, it was reshaping. The most profound shift, however, was internal. I stopped defining myself by what I had lost and started focusing on what I was learning. I learned that love cannot be sustained by one person's effort alone. no matter how strong the will. I learned that silence can wound deeper than words, that absence can hurt more than conflict. Most importantly, I learned that leaving isn't failure when staying means abandoning yourself. Divorce didn't make me weak. It revealed strength I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, months after Amelia and I had parted ways, I found myself sitting on a park bench at sunset, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. Families strolled by. Couples held hands, joggers passed with rhythmic footsteps. I sat there quietly, taking it all in, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of envy or the pang of emptiness. Instead, I felt gratitude for the lessons, for the release, for the chance to begin again. I realized then that my story wasn't just about loss. It was about rediscovery, about reclaiming pieces of myself I had abandoned in the name of holding a crumbling marriage together. If there's one truth that I've carried from this journey, it's that endings aren't the opposite of beginnings. They are the soil from which beginnings grow. Walking away from Amelia wasn't about erasing the years we shared. It was about honoring the fact that clinging to something dead would only bury me alongside it. By signing those papers, by choosing freedom over denial, I gave myself permission to hope again. I often think about what I would say to someone standing where I once stood, staring at a partner who has already checked out, convincing themselves that if they just try harder, things will get better. I would tell them this: you cannot fix what someone else refuses to hold with you. Love is not meant to be begged for or pried from clenched fists. If you find yourself carrying the weight alone, it is not love anymore. It is a burden, and you have the right to set it down. As for Amelia, I don't harbor hatred. Resentment comes and goes in fleeting waves. But mostly, I feel acceptance. She wanted a different life, one that no longer included me, and while the way she withdrew hurt, I understand now that forcing her to stay would have been cruel to both of us. She deserves to find her version of happiness, just as I deserve to find mine. Our paths crossed for a season, and that season has ended. These days, when people ask about my marriage, I don't flinch. I tell them honestly, it didn't work. We tried, we failed, and I learned. That's life. And instead of burying myself in regret, I carry forward the wisdom that came from the pain. I know now that love is more than vows spoken under an arch or promises whispered in the dark. Love is action, presence, and choice. Every day, every moment. Without those, it withers, no matter how strong the start. So here I am, not the man who lost his marriage, but the man who found himself again. The man who now greets mornings with clarity instead of dread, who fills his days with things that nourish him, who looks toward the future not with fear but with curiosity. Divorce was not the ending of my story, it was the rewriting of it. And though I never imagined I would walk this path, I'm grateful for where it has led me. If you take nothing else from my story, let it be this: sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Sometimes the most loving act is not clinging harder, but letting go. And though the road may be painful, though it may strip you bare, what waits on the other side is freedom, peace, and the chance to build something new, something true. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.